Now, have you ever been to a minor league baseball game? I've been to a few of them, but when we lived in Illinois, there was a minor league team just down the street from us. Literally within a mile. And so we would go every once in a while. But the thing I notice about minor league baseball is when you go there, there is a whole lot of hype. They have to build it up, and there's a lot of non-baseball activity that happens there at the games. They have little games that people play. They have fan competitions that they'll do in between innings, and they'll have entertainers that come out. They play music. They do lots of things. But why do they do it? Well, it's because it's not really great baseball. And so they're making up for the lack of baseball quality by creating hype, doing more of a show, trying to make it more fun for people. Now, a real baseball fan will enjoy the game anyway, but for most people, it just needs a little more, a little embellishment, if you will. Now, ironically, though, even if you go to a major league baseball game, where they are the best players in the world, they still have to create hype. They still announce the players with loud, confident excitement, and they play loud, energetic music, and they have to coax fans into cheering for players who they like and who they paid good money to go see. They still have to coax them into cheering for the team. And you could say even great players, their glory is limited. Now think about this. If you go to the beach or maybe to a lake that's surrounded by trees at sunset, you don't need an announcer telling you to take notice of it. You don't need an announcer telling you how incredible the view is. If you go stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon or at the foot of the Rockies, most people do two things. They will exclaim how amazing it is, and they will stand in silence. You see, these things have a kind of glory or greatness that is unmissable. It's unavoidable. But today we're going to talk about God's glory. And those things that I just mentioned, the Rockies, the Grand Canyon, those things that make us pause and take notice of their greatness, they were created by God. It's just a small glimpse of His glory. See, God's glory is vast. It is unrivaled. It is not lacking in any way, and it needs no hype. In fact, today we will read about Ezekiel's vision of God's glory. It's big, and it's amazing, and it's hard for him to explain what he's seeing. But before we get into that, let's talk about God's glory. What do we mean by that, or what are we referring to when we speak of God's glory? Well, generally, God's glory refers to His majesty, His splendor and beauty and greatness, or you could say His awesomeness. And more specifically, it refers to His character or His attributes, those things that make Him majestic and great. So His holiness, His moral perfection, His mighty power, His perfect love, His justice, His grace, His mercy, and we could go on. Things like that. And His glory refers to His exalted position, that He is the Most High, the one true God. He is the Creator who is sovereign over all people and all things. And that there is an honor or a reverence that belongs to Him alone. And it is due to or owed to Him alone. And one other thing, His glory is often represented or symbolized by sights and sounds. You may remember the large pillar of cloud, or pillar by day and pillar of fire by night, that led the people of Israel out of Egypt and around in the wilderness. That was a picture of God's glory and his presence there with them. But there are other ways that his glory is displayed, like pure bright light, blazing fire, thunder and lightning, loud, powerful noise. These are all symbolic representations of his majesty, of his awesome nature, of his character and his presence. Okay, so let's get into Ezekiel. We begin with a vision of indescribable glory. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1. In the 30th year, in the 4th month of the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Chebar Canal, the heavens were open, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, by the Chebar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. So the first 3 chapters of Ezekiel record Ezekiel's call or commission to being a prophet. And Ezekiel was a priest who was taken into exile with the first people, the first group that had been taken captive from Judah by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And so Jerusalem, at this point in time when he's writing this and having this vision, Jerusalem has not yet been destroyed. And Nebuchadnezzar had put a new king on the throne, but that king was subject to Nebuchadnezzar. And so at this point, Ezekiel is living in Babylon with the other exiles from Judah, and God calls him to be a prophet. And the time period of his ministry overlapped the latter part of Jeremiah's ministry back in Jerusalem. So we just talked about Jeremiah a few months ago, maybe a year ago. But we're overlapping in time a little bit here. So Ezekiel prophesied about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And then he prophesied about judgment coming to the nations surrounding Israel, who are also accountable to God. And then he prophesies about Israel's future return from exile and their hope of restoration. So let's jump into it. Verse 4. He says, as I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. So this is the beginning of Ezekiel's vision. It's through this vision that God commissions him as a prophet. Now, Ezekiel describes what he saw here, and you'll see it's a little hard to understand or fully picture what he says. And I think that's because Ezekiel was, on one hand, excited about what he was experiencing, but also it was hard for him to describe. He was seeing something that he couldn't fully describe. He's trying, but he didn't have the words to do it justice. And so, but this makes sense because this is a vision of God's glory. It cannot be fully described. It's overwhelming. It's awesome in the truest sense of the word. And so the vision, though, it starts with a display of power and immense bigness. These first things he saw are often associated with the presence of God. There was a powerful wind and a huge cloud and bright light and fire and lightning and brilliance or radiance. These are often associated with the presence of God. And so these things in nature make us think of power and greatness. Windstorms like tornadoes and hurricanes and fire can be destructive and can cause fear because they are so powerful and beyond our control. Bright light can be blinding and we may not even be able to look at it or even in that direction. And so these sights and sounds also remind us of when God met Moses on Mount Sinai. and gave them the law, the Ten Commandments. There was a display of God's presence on the mountain, and it scared the people of Israel. In fact, they said to Moses, "You go talk to him. We'll stay over here." Because it was so fearful to them. And in a way, that's understandable. Because if you've ever seen a flash of lightning above you, and then almost immediately you hear that loud crash of thunder, and you're like, that was right here, and it scares you, and you like want to jump out of your skin. That's kind of the feeling here. But on the mountain, there was smoke and fire and thunder and the loud sounds of trumpets, and the mountain shook. So we remember that. But all of these things display the awesome power and greatness and majesty of God in a way that we can understand. And so here in the vision, as the vision begins, Ezekiel sees, and I assume hears also, a great windstorm with a huge cloud that's full of flashing fire, and it's coming toward him. And the fire is constantly throwing up sparks, or it could be lightning flashing around the fire. And then in the center of the fire is this brilliantly bright light. And it looks like highly reflective metal that the light is shining off of. And this is just the beginning of his vision. But it announces the coming of God, that God's presence has arrived. Now, of course, we know God is everywhere, but this symbolizes God's presence coming there in a special way. Let's keep reading, verse 5. And from the midst of it, from the midst of the cloud, it came like the likeness of four creatures, and it was their appearance. This was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had four faces, and each of them had four wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on the four sides, they had human hands, and the four had their face and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The four had the face of a lion on the right side, and the four had the face of an ox on the left side, and the four had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces, and their wings were spread out above. Each creature had two wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while two covered their bodies. And each went straight forward wherever the Spirit would go. They went without turning as they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning, and the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning. Now as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the four of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the four had the same likeness, their appearance and construction being as it were a wheel within a wheel. When they went in any of their four directions, without turning as they went. And their rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all four were full of eyes all around. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. And when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them. For the spirit of living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went. And when those stood, these stood. And when those rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. So, out of the center of that brilliant, fiery windstorm comes these four living creatures. These are actually angelic beings. In fact, later in chapter 10, they are called cherubim, which is a kind of angel. And so he describes them, these four creatures, these angels, and their basic form looked human. but not entirely. And it's interesting as you read it, he kept saying appearance, appeared, it appeared, it appeared. He's like, well, this is the best way I could describe it, I guess. And so they appeared human. But as he describes them, yeah, they appear human, but they're not entirely human looking. I mean, they had 4 faces. One of a man, one of a lion, one of an ox, one of an eagle. And it appears in this that God is using common imagery of the time, of Ezekiel's time, to demonstrate his glory. See, in that culture of that day, divine or angelic beings were often depicted as being part human and part animal, expressing strength and greatness. And this image may seem strange to us to think of, but people of that time would easily make the connection. And so these angels, they had 4 wings. 2 were stretched upward and spread open. And then in humility, before God, they used the other 2 to cover themselves. And they had human hands under their wings. And they had feet like calves. And they looked like they were on fire, and lightning shot out from them. Now, the wings of each of these angels were spread open and touched the wings of the others, the one next to them. And so this suggests a unity between them. And they moved together in unison. And so when they moved, they didn't have to turn their bodies or their heads or anything. They just went straight in whatever direction they wanted to go or needed to go. And so they moved really fast in any direction. Well, then Ezekiel looked closer and he noticed wheels. And there was a wheel next to each of the angels, each of the creatures. And the best way he could describe them was, it was a wheel within a wheel. And this may have been like 2 perpendicular wheels, one that goes this way and one that goes this way, that were somehow connected, so one could spin this way and one could spin this way. Or it may have been more like a gyroscope, that goes in all directions. But whatever it was, it allowed the angels to move immediately in any direction. And Ezekiel also says they looked like jewels. Those wheels looked like jewels. And they were tall and awesome and full of eyes. Now, I don't know what that means. I don't know exactly what he's describing, but it's the best description he could give of something that was amazing and indescribable. And the angels, along with the wheels, moved wherever God's Spirit wanted them to move. Let's keep reading, verse 22. Over the heads of the creatures, the living creatures, there was the likeness of an expanse, shining like an awe-inspiring crystal, spread out above their heads. And under the expanse, their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another, and each creature had the 2 wings covering his body. And when they went, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army. When they stood still, they let down their wings. And there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads. When they stood still, they let down their wings. And so it appears that the 4 angels are carrying God's throne room. And he describes it in this way. He says there's an expanse. In other words, a large, wide open space, like a platform above the angels. And it seems to be resting on their wings, like they're carrying it, the ones that are spread open and touching each other. And this platform is awe-inspiring, and it's clear, and it looks like crystal or ice. And when the angels move, their wings make a loud noise. He says that sounds like rushing water, or rushing white water, or crashing waves. I mean, if you've ever been next to like a river that is just rushing really fast, you know that sound can be deafening, or waves that are crashing, the sound can be deafening. And he also compares this sound to the sound of battle. And so it's a powerful sound. And then he explains it's the sound of Almighty God. And then Ezekiel heard a voice coming from above the platform. Verse 26. And above the expanse over the heads there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire. And seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness of a human appearance. Notice those words, likeness, appearance. And upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around it, like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness all around. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. So now he sees what's on the platform above the angels. There's a throne that looks like it's made of sapphire, a bright jewel. And there's someone on that throne that looks kind of human. But from the waist up, he looks like shining radiant metal. And from the waist down, he looks like fire. And all around him is a bright light that looks like a rainbow. Now, maybe this means it was kind of iridescent light. I don't know. But it's very bright, and it stands out like a rainbow against dark clouds. Now this specific thing, the rainbow and the dark clouds, this may have had a special significance for Ezekiel and for the exiles with him, because they were in a dark place, and it seemed to them that God was far away. But in this vision, God is showing that his presence is, that he is present with his people. That his presence makes all the difference. He is the radiant light shining through the dark clouds. But at this point in the vision, Ezekiel recognizes that this is a demonstration of God's glory. And so he's seeing the greatness of God, the power, the awesomeness, the holiness, the majesty of God. And he responds by falling on his face. He humbly bows before God. He's seen a glimpse of God's glory. He's been confronted with the majesty and splendor and greatness of God. And so this is the only way to respond. And in the future, as he continues his ministry, this revelation of God's glory will motivate him, and it will move him forward as he serves God. But after showing Ezekiel this picture of his glory, God goes on in the following verses to commission Ezekiel as a prophet. And he tells him to speak to people who may not listen to him. He says, go and talk, but they'll probably not listen. Go give them a message, they're probably not going to listen. He's got a hard job in front of him. And so in order to encourage him, God gives him another demonstration of his majesty at the end, after the commission, or at the end of the commission. So turn over to chapter 3 and verse 12. He says, then the Spirit lifted me up, and I heard behind me the voice of a great earthquake. Blessed be the glory of the Lord from its place. It was the sound of the wings of the living creatures as they touched one another, and the sound of the wheels beside them, and the sound of the great earthquake. The Spirit lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness in the heat of my spirit, and the hand of the Lord being strong upon me. And I came to the exiles at Tel Aviv, and who were dwelling by the Chebar Canal, and I sat there where they were dwelling, and I sat there overwhelmed among them 7 days. So Ezekiel hears this booming voice praising God. It's the sound of the four angels again. And it sounded like an earthquake. It was powerful. And as the vision ends, Ezekiel finds himself back amongst his fellow exiles. And he just sits there for 7 days. Ezekiel is overwhelmed by all that he has seen and heard. It takes him a week to work through it all before he can do anything. That is the awesome nature of God. That's the greatness of his glory. Now, we today, we may not see an awe-inspiring vision like Ezekiel saw. But God does reveal himself to us through his word. And when we recognize God's glory, the Holy Spirit will use that in our lives to motivate and strengthen us and to move us forward and encourage us to keep going. And if we understand the greatness of God's glory, it can be overwhelming, but it will make us want to live for him. We belong to and serve the Almighty, one true God. There is no one greater, and there is no greater purpose in life. Well, another thing that is tied in with God's glory is his name or his reputation. How people think about him. And one thing that is repeated over and over again in the book of Ezekiel is the phrase, then you or then they will know that I am Yahweh, that I am the Lord, that I am Yahweh. And so we're going to look at some of that, but turn to chapter 20. Chapter 20 tells of a time when some of the Israelite leaders came to Ezekiel. And they asked him, they came to inquire of God. In other words, to ask God a question. So they came to the prophet to ask God a question. But God is not willing to answer their question. Instead, he tells Ezekiel to confront them with Israel's long history of sin and rebellion against him. And so in verses 6 and 7, God says that he had told Israel while they were still in Egypt to get rid of their idols, the gods that they served from Egypt. But they didn't. Now, the book of Exodus doesn't tell us about this. We only know about it from this statement from God, and possibly an allusion to it in Joshua 24, verse 14, where Joshua tells the Israelites to have nothing to do with the gods that their parents served in Egypt. But the point God is making here is that even though he told them to get rid of their idols, and even though they didn't, he still delivered them from Egypt. Look at verse 8 and 9. Chapter 20, verse 8 and 9. He says, but they rebelled against me and were not willing to listen to me. None of them cast away the detestable things their eyes feasted on, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. Then I said, I would pour out my wrath upon them and spend my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. He's saying, I could destroy them before I even take them out of the land. I can just leave them there and wipe them out. Verse 9. But I acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned or drugged down, made lesser in the sight of the nations among whom they lived, in whose sight I made myself known to them in bringing them out of the land of Egypt. So even though they didn't give up their false gods, he still delivered them. But why? For the sake of his own name or his reputation. So even though Israel was not honoring God, God delivered them so that the nations around them would know that he is the true God and that the gods of Egypt were no rival to him. And he delivered Israel so his reputation would not be drugged down, so people would know who he really is. And God continues then to go on and tell of their sin and rebellion. And he says that he gave them his law, including the Sabbath law, but they didn't keep it. And God had delivered them to be his people, but they rebelled against him and didn't live according to his ways. Look at verse 13 and 14. It says, but the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes, but rejected my rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live. And my Sabbaths they greatly profaned. Then I said, I would pour out my wrath upon them in the wilderness to make a full end of them. But I acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations in whose sight I had brought them out. So God could have destroyed them all at this point. He could have wiped them out, and he would have been just in doing so. But he didn't. Why? Because people might get the wrong idea about him. If he wiped out Israel in the wilderness, the nations, the people around would think that God wasn't able to protect them, and that God wasn't able to bring them in and give them the land that he told them he would give them. In fact, in Numbers 14, Moses prays for Israel, and this is exactly what Moses says. He says, if you wipe them out now, everyone's going to think you weren't able to protect them and take them into the land. And so God protected his name, his reputation, by not killing Israel off in judgment. And then God continues and he says that after he let them live, he caused them to wander in the wilderness while the older generation died off naturally. And then he warned the younger generation not to rebel like their parents did, but to live in God's ways and to keep his law. But they didn't. Look at verse 21. But the children rebelled against me. They did not walk in my statutes and were not careful to obey my rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live. They profaned my Sabbaths. Then I said, I would pour out my wrath upon them and spend my anger against them in the wilderness. But I withheld my hand and acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations, in whose sight I had brought them out. And so again, he didn't wipe them out for the sake of his name. He wasn't going to do this thing that might confuse people about who he really is. You see, the nations, they knew that God had brought them out of Egypt and delivered them from Egypt. The news about it spread everywhere. So all the nations knew about it. And when he did it, he demonstrated that he was the Almighty God, the true God. And his glory and his greatness would not be diminished in their eyes, in those people's eyes now. And so, at this same time, though, God also promised that he would send Israel into exile because of their disobedience. And then he did it. Verse 26 says that they might know that I am the Lord, that I am Yahweh. So he sent them into exile so Israel might know that he is Yahweh. He did it for the sake of his name, his reputation. So Israel will know that he is Yahweh. In other words, they will know who he really is. That they will know his glory. That they will know that he is holy. That they will know that he alone is God and he alone is to be worshiped. It's interesting. When Israel comes back from exile, they never again worship idols. Just a little extra tidbit there. They knew his name. And then we find out why God wouldn't answer the people's question. When they came to inquire, why wouldn't he answer? It's because they're just like their ancestors. They've continued in the same idolatry and rebellion against God. They don't live in his ways, but they sin in whatever way they want. They are dishonoring God. They are profaning or dishonoring his name. But God goes on and says that he will gather his people from exile. And he will, as he gathers them, he will separate those who are truly his people and those who are not. And he will purge the rebels from Israel. And so Israel, those who are truly his people, will know he is Yahweh. Those who want to continue in their idolatry, he says they can. but they will be judged. They won't bring down God's reputation and honor any longer. On the other hand, the faithful, they will be restored to their relationship with God. Look at verse 41. It says, as a pleasing aroma, I will accept you. He's speaking about the Israelites that are coming back, the faithful. I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you out of the countries where you have been scattered. And I will manifest my holiness among you in the sight of the nations. And you shall know that I am the Lord, I am Yahweh, when I bring you into the land of Israel, the country that I swore to give to your fathers. And there you shall remember your ways with all your deeds with which you have defiled yourselves, and you shall loathe yourselves for all the evil that you have committed, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. Then when I deal with you for my name's sake, not according to your evil ways, nor according to your corrupt deeds, O house of Israel, declares the Lord God. So Israel will worship God in Jerusalem, and God will make his holiness known to them. And their old sinful ways will grieve them. And they will turn away from those sinful ways and follow God. And they will know that he is Yahweh. They will rightly understand his glory. They will rightly understand who he is, and that he is their God, and that he is the only true God, and they will live in his ways, and they will worship him as he deserves. They will recognize God's glory and will live to glorify him. And then there's a few other passages where God continues to speak about this, about his name. In chapter 22, verses 13 and 22, God is speaking against the people of Jerusalem, and he says that he will judge them and take them into exile. They will no longer dishonor God with their sin, and they won't misrepresent him to the nations, but Judah's own reputation will be ruined, not God's. And in verse 16, he says, you will know that I am Yahweh. And he compares the people of Judah to polluted metal. But God will purify Israel through the exile. And then in verse 22, again, he says, you shall know that I am Yahweh. And then in chapter 36, verses 20-22, we find out that people from the nations were thinking that Israel was taken into exile because God wasn't able to protect them. And they assume that God is weak. But we know that the shortcoming was actually in the people of Israel, not in God. They were in exile because of their sin. And to demonstrate this truth, God says that he will restore his people to the land. And then the nations will know that he is Yahweh. They will know that he's the true God and that he is sovereign over all people. In fact, look at chapter 36 and verse 23. He says, and I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, and which you have profaned among them. And the nations will know that I am Yahweh, declares the Lord God, when through you I vindicate my holiness before their eyes. God will set things right, and people will see his glory. Now turn over to chapter 39. I just want to read a couple verses. 39, verse 7. He says, and my holy name I will make known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let my holy name be profaned any more. And the nations shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. Then turn over to down to verse 21. He says, I will set my glory among the nations, and all the nations shall see my judgment that I have executed, and my hand that I have laid on them. This passage, in this chapter 39, this passage is looking into the distant future after Israel is restored to the land. In fact, it's looking to time still future from today. At this time, God's holy name will no longer be dishonored. In fact, God won't allow it to be dishonored. but all of the nations will know that he is Yahweh, that he is the true God. God's name, his reputation, his glory will be recognized by all people. His holiness will be made known to all people. That's God's name, God's reputation. But let's go back to the visions of God's glory, because Ezekiel sees a couple more things, and I just want us to see. Ezekiel sees God's glory removed and restored. So in chapter 10, back in chapter 10, but in chapter 10, Ezekiel sees the same four angels and the platform with God's throne. In verses 6 and 7, there's a man who is dressed in linen who is told to go and get some coals from between the angels that are under the platform and to scatter those coals over Jerusalem. This is a picture of the city being destroyed in God's judgment. But let's pick it up in chapter 10, verse 18. It says, "The glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth before my eyes as they went out, with the wheels beside them. And they stood at the entrance of the east gate of the house of the Lord," or the temple, "and the glory of God of Israel was over them." And so the cloud of God's glory had filled the inner court of the temple. The temple was shining with bright light. And then the angel's wings made a loud noise, which again represents God's voice. And at this time, his glory, or we see his glory, it's great, it's in the temple. And now, I want to remind you, this is the same cloud that had come down many years earlier and filled the temple. After the temple was built and Solomon dedicated the temple, the cloud came down and filled the temple as a representation of God's presence there with the people, that he was dwelling with his people in a special way. And so the temple was God's house. And that cloud symbolized God's presence there with the people. But now, the cloud appears in the temple so it can be seen leaving. And that's what we just read, the verses we just read. So after the cloud enters the temple, the man gets the coals, and then the cloud, God's glory, it left the temple and went above the angels. And then they raise up from the earth and go out the east gate of the city, or of the temple. And the glory goes with them. Now, look at chapter 11, verse 17. "Therefore, say, thus says the Lord God, I will gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. And when they come there, they will remove from it all the detestable things and all its abominations, and I will give them one heart, and a new spirit I will put within them. I will remove the heart of stone and their flesh, and give them a heart of flesh. A heart of stone from their flesh, and I will give them a heart of flesh." Verse 20, "That they may walk in my statutes and keep my rules and obey them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. But as for those whose heart goes after their detestable things and their abominations, I will bring their deeds upon their own heads, declares the Lord." Verse 22, "Then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of God of Israel was over them. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east side of the city. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me in vision by the Spirit." Let's just stop there. So God had promised here to restore his people. And he will regather them, and he will bring them back into the land. And when he does that, he will change their hearts so that they will be able to obey him, and they will live to honor God. And we'll talk a little more about this passage in a few weeks. But right now, Israel is unfaithful. And the rebels who refuse to give up their idolatry will be judged. And so then the angels, along with God's glory, leave the city. And they go to the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem. The point is that God left the temple and Jerusalem. You see, the temple didn't make God great. God made the temple great. But God has removed his glory, removed his special presence in that sense from the temple, and has left them on their own to be judged for their sin. But look at chapter 43, all the way in the back of Ezekiel. Chapter 43, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Then he led me to the gate facing east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east. And the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was just like the vision that I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and just like the vision that I had seen by Chebar Canal. And I fell on my face. As the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. And behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. While the man was standing beside me, I heard one speaking to me out of the temple. And he said, 'Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever. And the house of Israel shall no more defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their whoring and by the dead bodies of their kings at their high places, by setting their threshold by my threshold and their doorpost beside my doorpost, with only a wall between me and them. They have defiled my holy name by their abominations and that they have committed, so I have consumed them in my anger.'" But what we see here in this vision is that the glory of God is coming back to the temple. Now this is the new temple that would be rebuilt because the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. And the glory comes back from the east, back from the same way that it went out. So it went out to the east and it came back from there. And it comes with powerful sounds and shining light because God is great and majestic. And the glory enters the temple, and God has made it his throne. He is claiming Jerusalem as his own, and it will be kept holy from that time on. And God promises to restore his people, and they will worship him there in Jerusalem. And the people will be made holy so that they will no longer dishonor God's name anymore. Now I have to point something out. God promised that the glory would return to the temple. After the exile, the people came back to the land. The temple was rebuilt. The temple that was standing in Jesus' day. But the cloud doesn't appear. It didn't return. But we're also told in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 5, "The glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together." Now, we're still waiting for that. We're still waiting for that revealing of God's glory where all people. But the day is coming when all people will behold his glory. But I have to ask, did God's glory ever return to the temple? Well, in a sense, it did. The statement that I just read from Isaiah 40 is from the same passage that speaks of a voice in the wilderness who is saying to prepare the way for the Lord. And we know this prophecy from Isaiah is applied to and fulfilled by John the Baptist, who prepared people for the coming of Jesus. And what does it say in John 1:14? In John 1:14, it says about Jesus, it says that the Word, or Jesus, became flesh and dwelt among us. Now that word dwelt is tabernacled or pitched his tent. And any Jewish person reading that would immediately think back to the tabernacle. And what happened on the tabernacle? When they built the tabernacle and they set it up, the cloud of God's glory came down and settled on the tabernacle, the same as it did within the temple later. And so he came and he tabernacled among us. He dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory. They saw his glory. What glory? Well, glory of the one and only. Glory of the unique Son of God. And Hebrews 1:3 says that about Jesus, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And so they saw God's glory. They saw the perfection of God in Jesus. And on the day that we call Palm Sunday, when Jesus had his triumphal entry, when he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, you know where he rode into Jerusalem from? The Mount of Olives, the mountain on the east. The same path that the glory took and will come back into. And he came in and he went into the temple. I just think that's pretty awesome. But is there an application in all of this for our lives? Well, first, know that he is Yahweh. Know that he is the Lord. Know that he is the one true God. Know that he is majestic. He is all-powerful. There is no one like him. Recognize his greatness, his glory, and give him the honor and reverence he deserves. And that also means live for his glory. Live to honor him. Live to glorify him. But what does it mean when we say to glorify him? I think we'll use these words sometimes and we just like, oh yeah, whatever. We know, we understand. But what does it mean to glorify him? As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:31, he says, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. So how do we glorify him? I mean, we can't add to his glory in the sense of making him somehow more holy or more great or more majestic. We can't make him more glorious. He is all glorious, all majestic. But we glorify him when we honor him for who he is. When we recognize who he is and respond correctly and act appropriately. We glorify him when we offer him the worship and the praise and the reverence that he deserves by submitting to him and obeying him and living in line with his ways and his morality, his truth. And we glorify him when we reflect his glory, when we reflect our lives, reflect his character. And so he is then honored through us, and he is acknowledged and correctly held in high esteem, both by us and by others. And we glorify God when we recognize and proclaim God's perfect reputation and his awesome majesty by our songs and our words and our lifestyle. He is God. He is holy. There is no one like him. He alone deserves our worship and our lives. Live for his glory.